Hello everybody, thank you for joining us in this, the third in our series of 4 autumn webinars this year in 2020. So this year has been a year when we've really all been doing a lot of presentations online. And whereas this time last year we were using Zoom, but not many people were, what we're now finding is that it's become a tool that almost everybody is using practically as often as their telephone or their email. So we spend all day in Zoom meetings. We spend a whole load of time about looking at Zoom meetings, and they're not always as good as they could be. So I'd just like to start with a little interactive brainstorm just to make sure that everyone is here and properly awake. So can you get into your Zoom chat for those of you who are with us on Zoom? Those of you on YouTube, you can put some comments into the YouTube comment box. And just tell me what you really don't like about Zoom meetings. So imagine you're in a Zoom meeting. What don't you like about those meetings? Kelly is first. So everyone with the microphone off. So that means speaking into silence. Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what I'm doing right now. Because indeed, if we have so many dozens of people on a webinar and people have the opportunity to have their microphone activated, well, the sound quality ends up being pretty terrible. And that's one of the things that people complain about the most. So sometimes having the mic off is the lesser of two evils, but at least you can have the possibility of having this chat channel, which really can help to keep people going. So what else do we have? So Patricia is saying, poor structure, too long, and insufficient interactivity. Well, it's great that we're saying that at the point when we're being interactive. So thank you, Patricia. And indeed, if it's not well structured or if it's too long, it doesn't help. But how long is too long? Now, a lot of the webinars that we've seen in the past have been like 90 minutes, 2 hours. The webinars we did in the spring of 2020, well, we made them last for 1 hour, including the question and answer session. And they were very popular. But as time goes on, Zoom fatigue has really crept in. And so we're now finding that this format that we're doing for this webinar of just half an hour is actually a lot more popular for people. So we're going to try and get really to the point, and that's very helpful. Joe. Great comment from Joe, the unrelenting, tiring stare of the camera. That's really a difficult thing because when you're in a real meeting in an amphitheater with 100 other people, well, you know that most times people aren't looking at you. Whereas when you're on Zoom and you've got your video activated, people are seeing this wall of different people. So you're effectively in the spotlight all the time. And that can be really tiring, as you say. Juggling between the screen shares. Now that can be difficult, but I've got a tip for you about that. So thanks for the comment, Deepika. I hope that the little tip I have, it's a simple one, but I find it really helpful. Edward is giving us too many options. So hard to explain to others what the host sees is different from what others see. And that's absolutely right. Certainly what I'm seeing on my screen is not what you're seeing on yours at the moment. And that is really difficult for everyone to understand. James, it's much more difficult to know when it's the right time to speak. That is true. Sometimes in your meetings, you have to kind of use a protocol within your teams where you say, well, okay, I'm just going to physically put up my hand to show that I'd like to say something, or you use the hand up function or whatever, but people don't always see that. So you really do need to work that out within your teams, but it's not easy. Sharing screens can be tough, that's right. And the polls never run as smoothly as you think they will. Well, that's true. We're going to be talking a little bit about the polls in a minute or two, but it's true that they don't always work exactly as we'd want. So that's a really good initial brainstorm on what we find difficult about these Zoom meetings. So I'm going to try and give you these pro tips. Now, pro tips, that doesn't mean I'm a professional. I am not trained in Zoom. These are just things that I have learned over this year in terms of all of the many webinars I've given, the many online classes I've given for different business schools, for our own clients. And I've learned a lot of things, sometimes the hard way. And I've also found that some of the things that I do actually have really helpful and that not everybody does. So I hope that you will find something really useful in what I'm giving to you today. And I'd really love your tips as well. So have a think about your tips, and if you can share those at the end, we'll be very, very happy to share them and of course give you the credit for them. So let's get started. Now, what exactly could we be thinking of when we think of pro tips for Zoom meetings? Well, we could think of a number of things which would be worth talking about. Effective slide design, how to use slides effectively, how to design them for online meetings to get people's attention. We could be talking about how to choose the appropriate microphones and how to use the appropriate lighting so that people can properly see you. We could talk about how to position your webcam so that you're making sure your webcam is at the same height as your eyes, for example. We could be talking about how to speak effectively in online meetings. And we could be talking about using virtual backgrounds in Zoom. Well, guess what? We're not going to talk about any of these things today. Why? Simply because we've already talked about them in some of our previous webinars. So I would certainly encourage you to have a look at our YouTube channel. If you're not already subscribed to it, please do, because we've already covered all these subjects. So when I was putting together this webinar, I had to be thinking, what else can I say? Because all of that is really useful. So I've tried to come up with a number of different thoughts for what you could be doing before your web meeting, your Zoom meeting, during your meeting, and after your meeting. And I've got 3 tips for you in each of them. So let's start with the before. And I've used a culinary visual analogy here. So it's the preparation, it's the kind of the main course. And then what comes after? Well, I live in France, so afterwards you have cheese and wine, because that's just what we French people do. So let's start with the before. Now, it was Franklin who said this wonderful thing: by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. And the real art of Zoom meetings starts way before. It's when you actually start to create that Zoom meeting in your Zoom interface. So there are many things that you can be doing at this point before your meeting starts to make it work successfully. So the first is to set up your parameters properly. Second is to prepare your surveys. And the third is to configure your slides. So let's take those one at a time. To think about the parameters first. Now, what I'd like to do here is actually to demonstrate to you how we can set up some of these parameters. So if I get out of my PowerPoint for a moment, then what you will see on the screen here is you will see my Zoom meeting. So in fact, this is not this meeting. These are the parameters for our next webinar next week, which is all about how to apply the principles of TED for business presentations. So what we can see here is several really useful things. Now, one of them that we found very helpful is the waiting room. So you can choose when you set up the meeting, do you want a waiting room or not? The waiting room will help you to ensure that you can be testing things, making sure your microphone is okay with a colleague before everyone else joins a meeting. That's what we did with this meeting today. It's not because we didn't want to see you, it's because we were just making sure everything was working before we started. So that can be helpful. What you can also do is once the meeting starts and you admit everybody, you can then switch off the waiting room. And that means anybody who joins a few minutes late, well, nobody has to manually admit them. That's a really helpful tip, but you can only do that once the meeting has already started, and it's only the Zoom host of the meeting who can make that change. So there are several other things you can be doing as well. One of the things that's very useful if you're running a webinar like this one is to make sure that you mute the participants upon entry. So that means as people join, their microphone is not active. And then there is a setting within the Zoom settings during the call, the same place where you can activate or deactivate the waiting room. You can also uncheck the option which allows people to unmute their microphones. And today we've used that, so that means you're not actually able to unmute your microphones. The good news is if I actually wanted anybody to be talking at some point, say somebody had a great point and we'd like to hear it, well, in that case, you can select them in the participants list and then ask them to unmute themselves, and then they can do so. But it's entirely under the control of the host and the co-host. And we'll come back to the co-host a little bit later. So these are some of the really useful little things that you can do, but it's good to get those set up in advance. Now, some of the other settings are actually not in the call settings. You need to go into your Zoom account settings and change these. So if you want to live stream your meeting, like we're live streaming today on YouTube, it's got to be allowed in your account settings first. That's really important. And if you go through all of these account settings, you'll find that there are a whole lot of other parameters which will apply by default, like can you use surveys and things like that. So if you haven't already done so, go through that, go through those account settings, look at all of these different settings, and this is not even all of them, and you will find that there are a whole lot of things which you can change, which you can set to make sure your call is exactly as you want it. So that is the first thing I wanted to say, is set up your parameters as you want it for your meeting. The second one is then to prepare your surveys. Now within Zoom, if you're in a call and you want to set up a survey, you actually can do that. You can set up a survey within the call, but you have to go out to the web browser to do so. And that can be a bit annoying. So if you're in the middle of a call and you want to set up a survey, well, great, you can, but it's not always straightforward. So it's always good to actually go into the meeting and try to set up the survey in advance. So I actually did that earlier on. I set up a poll and I'm just running that poll now. Just so the question is, are you still awake? And you have the opportunities to answer that question. Now, a little tip while I'm showing this poll is just to make sure that you understand those people who are following us on YouTube will not see the poll. Those people who are watching this on a recording afterwards, the poll is not recorded with the video. And that is sometimes really difficult if you're running a webinar. So remember, you're running a webinar, the Zoom surveys are not actually recorded. So if I end the poll, the great news is that practically everybody is still awake, and that's a good thing. And I'm very, very pleased about that. But it's really important, therefore, just to bear in mind, people will not see that, but you also need to set up those surveys in advance. And then the last thing before that I'm going to give you as a tip is configure your slides. Now, I'm not going to talk about slide design. That was the subject of another webinar. But sometimes it's important to remember how Zoom uses your slides. So when you are streaming them onto YouTube, and also when you're recording, unless you have changed your recording settings, the video of you speaking is going to be overlaid on the top right corner of the screen. So here, for example, we see my colleague Michael. Here, his video is basically over the top right corner of the screen. And that is not an ideal thing. So the key thing there is to make sure that you are not using stuff, you're not putting text or not putting anything that people need to see in that top right corner. And you also see that when going to YouTube, although not when recording locally, that Zoom actually puts its own logo as a watermark in the bottom right of the screen. And so you don't want to put any text-based elements there either. So this can be a difficulty if you get that wrong. So always prepare your slides, assuming that there might be video over the top right corner and the Zoom in that bottom right corner. Okay? So enough about before. Now let's get to the key point and let's think what we need to do during that meeting. So I've got 3 tips for during the meeting. I could give probably many more and you might have many more. The first one is always to make sure that you have a good co-host. The second, use a second screen. And the third is to spotlight the speaker. So firstly, the co-host. So I'm delighted today that Maheen is with us and she's acting as the co-host. So she's there to be managing the chat. She is there to be making sure people are muted if necessary, if they've been unmuted, to make sure the settings are appropriate, to switch off the waiting room, to handle the streaming onto YouTube, to handle the recording. All of these things are things that it's hard for me to do if I'm presenting. So it's useful to have a kind of a co-pilot or a co-host. Now, if you're used to watching people stream video gaming on Twitch or anything like that, then you'll know the concept of a mod or moderator. So these are people who don't actually speak on the stream, but they are there to manage participants, sometimes expel participants, and handle the chat and keep it engaging and interesting for people. Well, that's just as valid when you're running a meeting or a webinar using Zoom. So Marine is really a very important person to have with us today. That enables me to focus on what I need to do, which is to speak, to present, and to deliver the webinar. The second thing is, as I'm sharing my screen, I'm actually not sharing my laptop screen. Now you can't see that, but I actually have two screens. So I've got my laptop, which is right in front of me. I have my webcam on top of the laptop, but over here, I actually have a second external monitor. And what I've done is I'm sharing that second screen. So my PowerPoint is using presenter mode. So what I'm seeing on the screen where my webcam is, I am seeing the PowerPoint, I'm seeing the next slide that's coming. I'm also seeing the chat. I'm also seeing your videos. But what you're seeing that I'm sharing is only the PowerPoint slide. And that enables me to be changing things and have a lot more control than I would if I was just using my one internal screen. So having that second screen, I could not imagine delivering a webinar or an online presentation without it. Second screens are not too expensive. They're really, really worth the investment. The third thing then is the spotlight. So the spotlight function is important. So today I am spotlighted. You can spotlight up to 9 different speakers if you want to. But what this means is maybe you have 100 people in your meeting. You probably want people during a presentation to see only the one. So there's a difference between pinning and spotlighting. If you want to pin a speaker, then that happens that you do it locally on your computer. Doesn't affect what everybody else sees. If you as the host or co-host spotlight a speaker, and you can do that over in this little function here, you select the person. This comes from the Zoom help resource, which is very well worthwhile. You simply click on the speaker and say spotlight for everyone. And then hopefully everyone will see that person instead of everybody else while they're speaking. And you can simply remove that spotlight at the end if you want to by clicking in their camera and saying, or in their video and saying remove spotlight. Very simple. You can also have your own setting. I recommend everybody does this, and that is that in your own personal Zoom settings on your computer, you can set to spotlight your video when speaking. And this means that when you're speaking, everybody is really going to see you. I would recommend everybody does that. So these are important things. We don't always control what other people see, but you can control it with the screen, you can control it with the spotlight, and these are very, very helpful. So those are my little tips for what to do during a meeting. And lastly, what about after the meeting? Right? I don't want to make you feel hungry or thirsty with this wine or cheese. It's maybe not that time of day, but it's always worth having. So what do we do after the meeting to succeed? So one of the things that I always recommend doing is to edit the recording. You also are going to want to share the video, and you're probably going to want to share a handout. Now you may say, but we actually don't always need handouts and we don't always need videos. That's true, not always, but probably more often than you think. So if you're going to be sharing the recording of your online meeting, then you should be editing it. So for those of you who were here right at the start, we were chatting, I was saying hello, good to see some familiar faces and things like that. When people in 6 months or a year watch this video on YouTube, that will not be part of the video. The video will have a kind of nice little musical introduction, which says, hello, ideas on stage, etc. And then we'll go straight to the beginning of the webinar. It's very important that you cut out things that aren't worthwhile from that recording so that you have something that is worth watching. Because people judge a video on YouTube based on the first 30 seconds. And if the first 30 seconds are just people blabbering and chatting or whatever because things haven't started yet, then they might not watch the rest. So always edit that recording if you're going to be sharing it. And I recommend sharing it a lot more than we might have done before, because a lot of people who've signed up for the webinar today, for example, well, you know what? Something came up and they can't make it, but they'd probably love to see it. And for those of you who did make it, You might be thinking, I'd like to watch that back, or I'd like to share it with some of my colleagues, in which case having the video available is a lot more useful, because we all know, those of us who are familiar with presentation theory, is people forget most of what they hear pretty quickly. So you probably can't at this stage remember my first 6 tips, even though you see numbers 7, 8, and 9 here. Second of these after tips is to share that video. So it's not just a matter of editing the recording and maybe uploading it to YouTube. It's also share it proactively with people. This gives you the opportunity to remind them of your key messages, to remind them that you exist, and potentially to give them a bit of a call to action. So that's always worth doing. A day or 2 days after this kind of meeting, send them the video, remind them of the key things, and if there is a call to action, give it to them. And also, you may want to share a handout, because since people forget most of what they hear very quickly, we've made it a habit that when we run a webinar, we're also going to produce an online article which will help people to remember the key messages. And so because we remember a lot more of what we read than what we hear, that article accompanying the webinar is actually really helpful. And I'm delighted to say we do have an article for this one. Here is what it looks like on here. You'll see it looking a lot better on our website in the next couple of days, and we'll be very, very happy to share that with you. The handout really does increase the probability. The handout really does increase that probability that people will actually act on what you're saying. It's really worthwhile. And sometimes a handout, you want to give it before, sometimes you want to give it afterwards, but always do share something. On our training courses, we'll share something which looks like this, which is 40 or 50 pages with a whole lot of methodology in it. You don't always want to do that, but sometimes you can. And so we're going to give that handout after today. You've got all of these 9 tips in there, and also you'll be having the link to our playlist of all of our online webinars, where you can see the answers to all of those things I talked about earlier on, from myself and from my colleagues Michael and Pierre, who did some of those webinars earlier this year. That's enough for me from now. I've given you 3 tips for before, 3 tips for during, 3 tips for after. Now I'd love to hear your tips and also your questions about Zoom. And I'm hoping that you've learned something useful today. So can you tell me, do you have any questions about running Zoom meetings? And do you have any tips that I haven't covered today and which we can share? So Marine, over to you, if you can, to be asking the questions based on what people are putting in there.
Yes, we have one question from James. What about panning back so your hand movements are visible? Good or bad?
Now, this is a really good question, because when you're talking online, now what you can see from me at the moment, in fact, to make that even better, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so you can actually see me a little bit bigger. You're not seeing much of my gestures now. If I want to make my hands up there, then they're up here, and it's kind of looking like I'm a mad scientist of some kind. And when you put your hands really close to the screen, it can look very strange, like I'm some weird magician. But if I stand a lot further back, guess what? You might be able to just about see my gestures. However, you won't hear me as clearly because I'm further away from my microphone, which is just down here. If you have a headset, so sometimes I will present using a headset, especially on Teams, because Teams doesn't like my external microphone. Well, then if I've got the headset on, then I'm able to move around a lot more. But what I actually think in online meetings is really important is that the key gestures are the ones you make with your face. And if you're going to be a small window, sharing a screen means that the slides are quite big in Zoom and your screen is generally pretty small. You need to be making sure that your facial gestures are actually visible. So you're actually, your face is taking up most of that screen. So you want to be seeing head and shoulders, and that means you're not seeing much in the way of hand gestures, but a lot in the way of facial expressions. And you've got to be careful with those facial expressions and make sure they're positive. Great question, James. Thank you. Marine, do we have some more?
Yes, of course. Kelly was giving a tip. Use recreate breakout rooms to shuffle participants and make them meet new people. She said this is great for networking or teams who stick to only people they know.
Absolutely. Breakout rooms can be fantastic. I love using breakout rooms when I'm running a training course, and Zoom breakout rooms are extremely powerful. You can send them into a breakout room. You can send a broadcast message to everybody who is in the different breakout rooms, and you can call them back, which is something that you can't do on many of the other platforms. So you can actually give them 1 minute's notice, the breakout rooms are closing, and then everybody automatically comes back into the plenary room. So that wasn't one of my tips today, but thank you, Kelly. It's certainly something that's really powerful and helpful for a lot of people.
Yes, and thank you, Phil. Regarding the breakout, Patricia is asking if you have any tips specific to preparing and managing breakout sessions. This is more related to running a workshop and having subgroups team and report back.
Okay, great question, Patricia. So I've done this quite a lot over the year. What I have found that is really important when running these breakout sessions is to keep them quite short. Not too short because they never have time to do anything, but rather than having a half-hour breakout session, try and have maybe a 10-minute breakout session and give them something which doesn't take so long to do. And that will mean that they get to working a lot more dynamically. Parkinson's law, or one of them, says work expands to fill the time you allocate to it. So that means if you give them half an hour, they won't get much done in the first 15 minutes. Give them 10 minutes, then they have a sense of urgency. So it's better that you give them several exercises with just 10 minutes, and that can work really well. What I've also found useful is if I need them to do an exercise, then I will create a PowerPoint file. This is not a slide as such, it's more of a document with a kind of template that they can fill in. For example, when I need them to analyze the audience, their burning needs, and the context, then I will give them a kind of almost empty PowerPoint template, which has the table of the ABC, audience, burning need, context, and a table that they can fill in. And sometimes I'll give them a case study in there so that they can discover that within their group. That way they have a simple way to be capturing the results of their work. And if you can direct their work like that, then you get results so much faster. So those are things which I certainly recommend.
Okay, thank you, Phil. James is giving another tip. If you need a perfect transcript quickly, try editing the video via Descript.
Yep, I didn't know that tool, so I'll check that out. Thanks, James. That sounds like a really interesting tip. So that's Descript. And I think Jean-Marc has a question, Mahine.
Yes. How do you maintain eye contact with your webcam? Use a small sign which says, look here.
Well, we've got a little tip for the webcam, because the thing is with a webcam is it tends to be above, like at the top of your screen. There are actually rumors that Apple or other manufacturers are going to be making screens with a webcam kind of hidden in the middle of the screen so that you can be looking at the people's video while actually also looking at the webcam. What I'm having to do here is to look above my screen, because my webcam, it's an external 4K webcam above my screen, which means I'm not really looking at you. Partly it comes with practice, but a little tip that we found is looking at one circle is not easy. Looking at two circles, it looks like you're looking in a pair of eyes. So we take a little Post-it note. So you just take your little sticky note, cut out a little circle of it and stick it next to your webcam. And that way you have two things there, two like a pair of eyes, and it's so much easier to look at.
Good. We have another question from Deepika. We often observe a spillover of speaker sessions. Without being rude to each time, tell them to keep track of time. Is there a way where Zoom offers a timer?
A timer or some kind of countdown. I'm not actually aware of that. What I have done in certain sessions is where, for example, I'm asking people to deliver presentations, because I often give like presentation training classes where I'm having to get people to do something. Well, what I have in my PowerPoint is I will have a video, which is a countdown timer. So if I want them to speak for 30 seconds, I will give them 30 seconds and I'll share that on my screen so they can actually see the countdown and see when it's finished. It doesn't always stop people from speaking, but at least it makes them know when they've run over time. And sometimes that's really helpful. I'm actually just planning an online event with a major client where we're going to have their chief executive answering questions, and we're going to put a 45-second countdown for his answers. So he's limited to 45 seconds, and that's what we'll be doing. I think that will make it a lot more interesting than having someone go on and on and on.
Yes.
I hope that's a helpful tip.
Great. Another tip from Kelly, using online interactive tools like Miro and Padlet are great for creating more interactivity. And Jean-Marc is saying a useful democratic way to select questions for a panel is to get participants to uptick them and take the most popular. Can this be done with Zoom?
Yes, but it's a bit of a manual process. So I think the point is a very good one. What I love in tools like Bcast, for example, is where, and the same with Weassembly and many others, is where people can enter questions and other people can vote for them, and then you ask the most relevant ones. When I'm on stage, doesn't happen very much nowadays because of the lockdowns, but when I'm on stage and moderating a panel, I love to have that. I will have that on my tablet in front of me so that I can select the most popular questions and ask them to the panel. In Zoom, if you want to do that, then what you really first need to do is to have people ask their questions in the chat, and then the co-pilot or moderator or co-host will have to copy and paste them manually into a Zoom survey, and then launch the survey where people can give a multiple choice answers, and that way you can have them vote for those questions. It's not ideal, it is manual, but it can be done as long as you've got somebody who is a co-host and not the main host who is doing it. So that's all we've got time for today. We've spent a little half hour there going through several questions. Some of you have shared some really useful tips, and I'd like to thank you for those. I'd like to thank you very much for your time. I really hope you've learned something useful. Even if you knew some of those tips, I hope some of them are new for you and that it gives you a new way to be thinking about your online meetings. So please join us next week. We've got our last in our webinars of this season, where I'll be talking about how to apply lessons from TED to change our business presentations forever. And don't forget, on our YouTube channel, if you subscribe to that, you've got a whole lot of our previous webinars and videos. There's a whole load of stuff there, so please do take a look. And if you subscribe, you follow us on LinkedIn, well, then you'll be able to get advance notice of all of the upcoming webinars that we'll be putting on in the near future. So we look forward to seeing you again, and we hope we'll see you next week. All the very best. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.